Hello, and welcome to Come to Think of It. My name is Steve Nemirovsky, and I'm your host. As you're aware, I don't favor discussions that just belabor problems. I'm big on finding guests who can present solutions, especially solutions for our pervasive societal concerns. So for the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to be in a solution mode for a very serious problem: how disinformation and misinformation are sabotaging America. On previous episodes, we have presented alternatives for finding factual content in the media, and we've also examined scenarios, primarily on college campuses, where free speech has been greatly diminished. But we haven't yet attempted to examine the broader context and implications of systematic disinformation and how this can, if not adequately checked, have serious, if not existential implications for our democracy. Our guest is Barbara McQuade. She's a former U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan and current law professor at the University of Michigan. Her book, The Attack from Within, presents a long list of thoughtful and intriguing solutions. Bad teleprompter day. Most importantly, she is a class act. I'll explain why later in the show. Professor, welcome to Come to Think of It.
Thanks very much. Glad to be here with you.
I'm glad I'm talking to you now instead of that teleprompter was killing me. So, great book, and you used some of my favorite quotes. One of which is basically, everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. And I think that's kind of the theme of this. We need to have facts to have a thriving democracy, but we could also have many opinions. It's where we cross over that line where there's too much disinformation, too much misinformation, and there is, as you call it, an attack from within.
Yes, it seems that in my time as an adult, I have seen people go from having disagreements about policy, which I think are the essence of a democracy. Some people want a bigger government or a smaller government, or think government can solve problems, and others think private sector can solve more problems. Those are all valid views and arguments to have. But when one group of people believe one set of facts and another group of people believe a different set of facts, it's very difficult to reach any sort of consensus or compromise, which, after all, is the whole art of politics. To get anything done, we need to be able to compromise. But I think because of this environment we are in with so much disinformation, it is now very difficult for people to have these kinds of debates where we have an agreement on the same set of facts.
So this book had to take a lot of time and a lot of research, and people just don't wake up one day and say, hey, I think I'll start writing a book. What was the impetus for this? Was it growing over the years, like you said, watching what was happening, and then making this kind of a commitment?
Yes, so I spent most of my career as a national security prosecutor, and during the time I did that work, I saw the threat to national security in the United States evolve from Al-Qaeda to ISIS to Russian cyber intrusions, to a time when the Department of Homeland Security concluded in recent years that the greatest threat to the homeland is disinformation. I now teach at the University of Michigan Law School. One of the courses I teach is a course on national security, and each year a larger and larger percentage of the syllabus has been focused on information warfare, mostly focusing on external threats from Russia, China, and other countries. And I started assigning in about 2018 Robert Mueller's report on the Russian influence operations in our 2016 election. And so based on some of the things I learned in my reading, in my study, in my teaching, I wanted to write a book that's accessible to members of the public, to raise awareness of this problem, to help people understand the tactics, in hopes that if we recognize some of these tactics that are being used against us, we can build resilience against them and get back to a place where we all can understand the facts and have reasonable debate to reach real solutions.
Well, this is right in my wheelhouse. And before we get into the book and the topic for today, I've talked to my guests through the teleprompter, my audience, about where I go to for facts right now. And what I've done is I've just turned the television off. Mm-hmm. I don't go to the television for any facts at all. And I'm not a technical guy, so I'm not on a lot of websites or TikToks or any of this kind of stuff. So I found the only really newspaper-like presentation I can go to that I think I can get information from is the Wall Street Journal. Mm-hmm. Beyond that, I've now gone to much more lengthy pieces. So if I want to understand a topic, I'll read a much more extended journal-type story on it, because I find that those presentations, although they may not be totally accurate or totally factual, they usually present the entire scope of the conversation. So that's where I'm going these days. Where are you going when you want facts?
Yeah, one of the things that I think is so important that I tell people is it's really important to consume more than one source of media. Because I think that in general, the Wall Street Journal or the BBC, other media outlets are generally credible. I think that they all have their own editorial viewpoint and editorial discretion. And so it may be that what they share with you is accurate, but they're not sharing with you all of the stories you might find to be relevant. And so reading a number of different outlets can be helpful in seeing that big picture. But the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, BBC are certainly all sources I consider credible. And then when I'm looking for specific facts, there's some really good fact-checking sites out there. There's one called Snopes.com. There's something called factcheck.org and another called politifact.com. And what's great about those is they will take a topic and, as you just said, share all of the information, share all the perspectives on it, share things that are somewhat supported, sort of supported. Like, for example, there's a great discussion on Snopes.com of Hunter Biden's laptop, because there is so much about that. Some of it is accurate, some of it is conspiracy theory and lifted up, but it will tell you this is what's been documented and here is the evidence. Here are some claims that are unsupported, and I think it gives you, in the same way you're talking about reading those longer form journalist articles, gives you that bigger picture, I think, where you can appreciate some of the nuance, which is one of the things that I worry is lost in our .com world today.
Yeah, I don't do a lot of blog stuff or a lot of podcast stuff, but when I'm studying politics in particular, I will do some of that. And then, as you suggested, though, I'm going over to the far left, I'm going to the far right. I'm trying to figure out how they're attacking similar issues or what they're presenting. Usually it's just total garbage, but at least that's how I try and balance it out. So I want to get to solutions, but I still do want to do some problems. Mm-hmm. And your book is replete with examples of really why disinformation is causing the attack from within. When you try and think of what you could solve or want to solve, what are the 2 or 3 most important problems, I guess, that are on your mind when you're writing a book like this that you want to solve for?
Well, I think, one of the things that prompted me to write the book, and that is on my mind, is the way that technology, and in particular social media, has become a forum for disinformation. And it's still in its infancy. We haven't quite figured out how to deal with it. But as a result, anybody can publish anything. They can reach millions of audience members anywhere in the world in an instant, and they can do so under a false name. And so that's one of the things that Robert Mueller discovered, and as I documented in my book, false personas online posing as ordinary Americans and then pushing false information to try to nudge people to change their opinions on things. So, for example, posing as people on the left and the right of the political spectrum, posing as someone called Blacktivist. So, this is the Russian Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, Russia. The same guy in a hoodie at a keyboard might pose as Blacktivist, pushing things about that might appeal to African Americans, and then pushing them either for or against particular political candidates, thinking that this was a very credible source of political activism from an African American. In the same way, it might have been the same guy sitting at the same computer, wearing the same hoodie, posed as Army of Jesus, pushing things from a Christian perspective. That, I'm a good Christian, and here's, 9 out of 10 of my posts are all about living the good, according to the good book. And then the 10th, nudges you again toward some sort of social agenda. And according to Mueller, the agenda there was not, pro one candidate in America versus another candidate in America. It was pro-Russia. It was about sowing discord in society, getting us mad at each other by taking every fault line in society, whether it's abortion rights or immigration or affirmative action, LGBTQ rights, whatever it is, and fomenting anger on both sides of that divide by posing as real people who are all just a few guys sitting in a boiler room. So the ability of social media to be able to influence public opinion, I think, is a very significant problem. The advance of technology, I think, is growing all the more worrisome. In recent years, we have seen artificial intelligence now create brand new ways of pushing disinformation. You can create now a video or an audio recording of somebody saying or doing things they never said or did, and it looks very authentic, but we have no regulations, we have no labeling requirements. And so it is quite possible for people to create false impressions about many things, including influencing public opinion. And then I guess the last one I'll mention is our deeply polarized political system. You know, as we started talking about, there was a time not so long ago when we could have differences of public opinion, but still get along, still work together, still live together, still socialize together, even though we might disagree about, you know, what the budget bill ought to say or some other, what our position on immigration ought to be in this country. Instead, I think we have seen both parties really stoke this idea of divide and conquer. It isn't enough to say, I disagree with my opponent. We now say, my opponent is the devil. My opponent hates America. And if you support my opponent, then you also are the devil. So this idea of demonizing our opponents. And we definitely see that on the right and the left. They do it because it works. The data show that people will be motivated to turn out to the polls when they believe that this election is the most important election of my lifetime, and I better get out there and show up at the polls and vote for my guy, because otherwise this other guy is going to destroy our country. And that, I think, has created some serious problems in civil discourse. One final, I've given you three, I'll call this one 3A, is dark money in politics, which I think gives some people an outsized influence on the direction of our democracy. You know, we're supposed to be a country of equality, of one person, one vote. And if you are able to stuff tens of millions of dollars into a PAC to go after whatever cause or whatever issue is important to you, that is, I think, political power that does not reflect equality in society.
But going backwards, that one per se, if they've dumped the money in, but aren't using it to create disinformation and misinformation, is kind of outside the book. That's a distortion of the political system, but maybe it's not.
But I think it is part of the attack, because what we see is these super PACs are not required to disclose their donors. And so you might have a super PAC with a name like Red, White, and Blue Grandmothers of America. Who could fault them? And in fact, it's, you know, like one guy who owns a gun company. We wouldn't know that, who actually is behind all of these things. So I think that, you know.
Which kind of goes back to your first concept of, in all these, the Russian over there, we don't know who it even was that was putting this stuff out. So one of your big concerns, I think, and I share that with you, is we don't even know who's creating this stuff. So it's disinformation and information created by fictitious. And it could be just created by a robot now, right?
Yeah,
with AI.
Sure.
With the right direction, AI could be spitting out stuff.
Yes, and all designed to influence public opinion in one direction or another, not according to, you know, some agenda that we share as Americans, but foreign influence or some political operative who wants to advance their agenda and is deceiving us through this disinformation and various tactics.
Yeah, no, my list, we did your list, but I don't know if my list is as important as yours. I worry more about the foreign stuff than I do the domestic, although I think they've just blended together at this point. You can't tell the difference. But, you know, as your book mentions, going back with the KGB, 30, 40 years ago, the KGB wanted to set something up to disrupt the judicial system, right? So this is kind of an old theme, but we've made it current, and now now we can't stop it to a certain extent. I mean, as someone who's Jewish, we had the attack in Israel on October 7th. On October 8th, there was already a whole jihadist messaging in place. Israel hadn't even responded yet. And, you know, this spilled over to campuses, and then to a certain extent, this spills over to free speech. Now, I don't know, do you teach anything on free speech in your classes? Or?
Certainly, we cover the tensions with free speech as it relates to national security and public safety.
Because you mentioned free speech in here and the democracy. I want to talk about that later. But one of my specific questions, and I asked a gentleman from FIRE, the organization that rates universities on free speech, how do you think the framers would react to the notion that we're supposed to have free speech and we have the amendment to the Constitution? versus is free speech only from someone if I know who's speaking it, or is free speech can it be an anonymous source of speech? Have you ever talked about that in your classes, that whether or not free
Yes.
speech only relates to knowing who made the statement in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, free speech is tricky because it's framed as an absolute in our Constitution. Congress shall make no law abridging the right of free speech. But of course, you have to read that clause in connection with the larger document, which also requires providing for the common defense and promoting the public welfare. And so it requires a lot of balancing to decide how to get those things right. But anonymous speech, I think, is something that is very interesting when it comes to social media, because what we talk about in the marketplace of ideas, right, is we want people to express their views, good, bad, offensive, ugly, whatever they are, on the theory that it's like a market. The best ideas will rise to the top. Most people will subscribe to those. These bad ideas will be rejected, or offensive ideas will be tossed aside. That's the idea of the marketplace of ideas. But as you say, in this world of technology, we don't know who's saying it or why they're saying it. And so sometimes, I know Elon Musk will often say that social media is the digital town square. Well, is it? In the town square, I can see who's speaking.
Exactly.
I might know that guy, like, oh, that guy's
Exactly.
a goofball, or that guy's brilliant. I can hear what they're saying. I can see how the crowd is really reacting. Are they cheering? Are they booing? Are they walking by because they're indifferent? But on social media, we may have a Russian guy in a hoodie pretending to be blacktivist.
Right.
And so I don't really know who it is who's speaking. In fact, I'm deceived into believing it's someone who is not what he appears to be. And we've got trolls and bots out there who are either rejecting the message or amplifying the message and saying, this is great, isn't this a great message? When in fact, it may be these aren't even real people. These are all just bots who are trying to push whatever this message is. And so that is far afield, I think, from the person standing on their soapbox in the town square. And so consequently, I think that we ought to think about some methods of regulation that help us to avoid being deceived by people who are using technology to pretend to be someone that they are not.
That's a great segue. So what we're going to do is I'm going to turn to the teleprompter and tell my guests we're going to take a quick break, and then we're coming back with a whole list of solutions with Professor Barbara McQuade. Food Bank of the Rockies is the largest hunger relief organization in the Rocky Mountain region. Currently, they are responding to the highest levels of hunger they've seen in 10 years. Through their network of hunger relief partners, including those here in Aspen, and food distribution events, the food bank is committed to providing nutritious and familiar foods to individuals across the Western Slope. Here's an example of their great work.
When I saw the long line of cars, I thought there's such a need in the valley. What it feels like when you don't have food is that you've let your family down. I'm Sherry Lee, I'm 62 years old, and I live in Grand Junction, Colorado. We were homeless, and they fed us. We're better off than we've ever been, thanks to the Food Bank of the Rockies.
We're back with Professor Barbara McQuade and talking about her book, The Attack from Within. And we're focusing on how disinformation and misinformation is really an existential threat to our democracy. In the first segment, we talked about defining some of the problem areas that the professor sees as the ones that really need to be dealt with. I threw a couple of my own out there. But as I mentioned in the beginning, her book comes up with some very excellent ideas for how to take this on, and we're going to spend the rest of the show on solutions. So thank you again. And we're closing again with this notion that it's really tricky in a democracy where you have this amendment for free speech and at the same time figure out what you can or can't rein in. And in fact, I think at the beginning of your book where you talk about solutions, you specifically mentioned Europe can get to some solutions that perhaps we can't because they don't have our Constitution. So what are some things they've done for solutions but are outside the context of perhaps our Constitution?
Yeah, so first let me say, I think the First Amendment to our Constitution is an incredible freedom that I don't think any of us would wish away, whether you're on the right or the left or anywhere in between. It gives us our right to speak out when we object to our government. And so it is a fundamental pillar of American democracy.
And I'm
But-
with you 100%.
Yeah, but we see in Europe, we see in the UK stronger defamation laws, for example, that I think provide stronger disincentives to people from saying things that are false. In Germany, there have been rules against, I think, hate groups for fear of, neo-Nazism after the Holocaust. So understandable that each country has its own unique history. But in the United States, hate speech, as hideous as it is still protected by the First Amendment. The block only comes at a very, very high bar. The Supreme Court said in a case called Brandenburg versus Ohio that when you are speaking hate speech, it really can only be criminalized as incitement if it is likely to cause imminent violent action. And that's what the speaker intends. So, if you've got the angry mob and you send them out to attack somebody, that could be criminal. But otherwise, hate speech is protected. So, it's a blessing and a curse in a way, I suppose. Like if we didn't have the First Amendment, there are probably a lot more things that we could do. But I think all in all, I'm glad that we have it because it does protect our rights to say things, even when those things are unpopular.
And you do something I think is very clever, that you break this down into supply side and demand side.
Mm-hmm.
So supply side obviously being the guy over in Russia who's dumping stuff in the United States, and the demand side from the perspective of someone in the United States choosing to find this or not find it. And I just thought it was very clever, so congratulations on that. And let's start with the supply side, because you start with the supply side. Yep. And one of the things that you start with is Section 230. Again, Section 230 of what, and what is Section 230?
Yes, so Section 230 is part of the Telecommunications Decency Act of 1996. And, it's almost 30 years ago now. It set out some laws that protected internet service providers from legal liability, civil liability, for hosting content on their platforms. This is what gave rise to social media platforms, things that maybe they weren't even thinking about back then. But the idea in 1996 was the internet is still kind of in its infancy, so let's encourage innovation and investment. And we want to make sure people feel like, well, if somebody posts something on my platform, I don't want to get sued for it. And so basically they said, you're just the platform and people can post stuff there. And if there's some sort of defamation, you can always go after the person who posted it, but the platforms are free from legal liability. Made a lot of sense, I think, in 1996. Here we are almost 30 years later, and I think things have changed such that maybe we ought to consider amending Section 230. I wouldn't eliminate it entirely, but I think we should consider amending it. As I say in the book, treating the internet the same way we treat it today as we treated it 30 years ago is a little like raising a baby alligator in your bathtub. Like, it's adorable when it's a little baby and can't do anything wrong, but then, when it grows into a man-eating predator, maybe it's time to rethink how you're treating this thing. And we know now that the internet can be this incredibly dangerous place for spreading disinformation. And so, mindful and respectful of the First Amendment, I don't think I would advocate in any way, censoring any of the information that's put there. People are going to say things. People are going to post things. How do you decide what is true and what's not true, what's opinion and what's not? But I think some of the things we could do is...
Well, I want to get there in a second, but just to slow down on Section 230 itself. And I think you said it beautifully, but I want to emphasize this for our audience. A lot of times when there's a new idea, legislators say, we want to let this run a little bit before we rein it in. So as you're saying, back in the 1990s, the internet was a new thing. They wanted to let it run, the baby alligator. And then here we are 30 years later with this voracious alligator. So there's a kind of a little lesson in government that I want everybody to know. Going back, though, to Section 230, do you have any idea of who was pushing this? In other words, was the telecommunications industry behind it? Because the companies that are here today, the Googles and maybe I don't know who else is, the TikToks of the ones, they weren't there then to be part of that conversation. So I'm just wondering, in terms of the growth context, we understand that theory, but who are some of the players even at the table debating this part?
Yeah,
Do you have any sense of that?
I don't know, but the term they use then is internet service providers. It doesn't even say social media platforms because those didn't exist at the time. So, internet service providers could be everything from...
There's the old-fashioned AOL at the time,
yeah,
right?
exactly, right?
You've got mail.
The people who are providing you with your internet. So it likely was some of those companies. And, many of them were the telecommunications giants. But as you say, the idea then was, let's let it run and see what this turns out to be. Well, here we are. And we haven't had any meaningful regulation, in part, I think, because now we do have these giants like Mark Zuckerberg at Meta and Elon Musk at X, and they are now very generously giving to...
They're not wanting liability.
Right. They're generously giving not only to the president, but to members of Congress in an effort to say, we got this. We've got a lot of internal systems. It's all good. I would submit that we could make some modest amendments to Section 230 that would retain their immunity from some of the content that's posted there. I don't think that we can hold them liable for all of the billions of messages that get sent over X and Meta every day. But one thing I think we could do is hold them liable for their own conduct. So there was a Facebook whistleblower by the name of Frances Haugen. She was a former data scientist at Facebook, and she testified before Congress a few years ago. I talk about her testimony in the book. And one of the things she said in her congressional testimony was, it's not the content that's so bad. It is the algorithms. Algorithm is simply computer code that tells a program what to do or what not to do. And what she said is at Facebook, they were cranking up the algorithm to promote outrage. Because what they had learned through surveys and data collection is that the more outraged a user was from content, the longer they were likely to stay on. It promoted what they call engagement. Because you saw something that got you worked up, you're sending it to your friends, you have to respond to it. Can you believe this? This person thinks this is so wrong, and arguing with them. And what she said is, the more engagements they got, the more they could charge advertisers, because people were staying on the platform longer. And so Facebook was cranking up the algorithm for outrage, different from what it might otherwise be. There was a time when Facebook was just chronologically what your friends were posting. And then they started posting this news feed coming out to you, because then they could control the content that you would see. Facebook has that. X has it. We know from some of the studies that have been done since Elon Musk bought X that the algorithm has changed and that the content has changed tremendously. A lot of it is now amplifying his own posts, but also posts of far-right sort of destructive troll-like behavior on X. And so that is the algorithm. So why can't we...
So the thought that someone goes on somewhere and they're reading something or whatever, that's the first step. That's the okay step. But if one of these companies now wants to monetize this, create the outrage, have more advertising revenue comes with it, and start shooting you through an algorithm to other places, they now should become responsible for the second, third, and fourth step in the process.
Yes, because their algorithm is something they designed.
They designed,
right? So, Section 230 said it's unfair and overly, prohibitively expensive to make internet service providers responsible for every post everybody in the world posts out there, because people are going to say outrageous things, people are going to say false things, people are going to say defamatory things. Right. But they should be responsible for their own conduct. So if they're creating algorithms that are harmful to society, maybe that is the place where we say, you don't get immunity for that. Okay. That is something where you could be held legally responsible. Maybe we have it governed by something like the Federal Trade Commission. Maybe we create a new agency that looks at these algorithms. There's one argument is that you make them all public, but I think that's proprietary information. There was a time I served on the board of a bank, and the banking industry answers to dozens of regulators. You've got to assure people that you've got sufficient deposits to cover potential withdrawals. You've got to make sure you're not engaged in any unlawful money laundering, even unwittingly. You've got to make sure that you are not discriminating against anybody who is seeking a loan. And you've got all kinds of regulators looking over these things. The internet, which arguably affects our daily communications, is subject to no regulations whatsoever. So regulators to look over, I think, the algorithms could be one way to reduce some of the manipulation that we see there.
And I think you suggest that these are effectively become utilities.
Yeah.
And utilities are regulated.
Sure.
So we could use a model like that. One of the things that I've written about that getting nowhere, of course, like most of the stuff I write about, I guess. I think laws like this should just have had sunsets.
Yep, sunsets
I mean,
are a great thing.
Right now, we have a nascent industry, we want to let it run. Okay.
Yep. 5 years,
someone at
10
that point
years,
should say,
right.
how long should we let it run?
Yes.
The answer should be 10 years. And then at 10 years, the sunset, for the viewers, sunset meaning the law would end unless it's extended.
But it forces you to the table for fresh debate.
Yes, I think we're at the point now, since our government doesn't do anything anymore, almost anything they pass should have a sunset, and always have to bring them back to the table. But if you had a sunset in this case, even a 15-year-old alligator would have been better than a 30-year-old alligator. And I don't know if you've thought this through, though. So what becomes the consequences, then, of losing this immunity, though? How do you...
Well, I think it exposes you to civil liability, whether that comes from government lawsuits or government fines, or individual, private litigants could file lawsuits. So I think those would be the consequences, and they'd have to be significant enough that the billionaire social media company can't just say it's a traffic ticket, I'm going to write that off. And so I think in the same way we have government regulators who go after antitrust violators or savings and loans and banks that violate the public trust. I think in the same way we could have a regulatory authority that would oversee social media to make sure that they're complying with the algorithm rules. The other thing that I think we could condition that immunity on is protecting the private data of users. So one of the ways that we get manipulated is that we are micro-targeted based on our own likes and shares, because all of that information is constantly collected and creating profiles about each of us. And so the ads that you get at an election season are different from the ads I get in election season, because they know what will resonate with you. It's why whenever I do, I go on X or Meta or one of these, I will be bombarded with ads for Detroit Tigers baseball caps. Okay. They know me so well, right? I post about the Tigers, my favorite baseball team, and sure enough, they send that back to me because they know me, maybe better than I know myself. But it's what allows, that data then gets sold to data brokers who sell it to private enterprise and sell it to political operatives. So advertisers know what you might like and what might tickle your funny bone, but so do political operatives. This was part of the scandal of Cambridge Analytica, which was the analytics company that was funded by Steve Bannon out of Cambridge in the UK with data scientists who utilized Facebook's research arm. At the time, they were violating the terms of agreement with Facebook, but they were using some of that data to create voter profiles. And they would find people who were likely to, Republican voters, likely Democratic voters, and then pushing messages to them to nudge them to act in certain ways. And so, again, why can't we control what they do with our private data and have some regulators looking over that? I think today most of us get that, do we accept the cookies? Do we accept the terms of service? Click, yeah, I want to see my search, and let's move on. What if we had regulators there who are saying it is not acceptable to sell people's personal data except under these circumstances? And that is one of the things that we've seen in Europe, is requiring a much more consumer-focused data privacy regulation than we have in the United States today.
So you're coming as a law professor, and as someone, as you said, was in the field of international sabotage, or whatever the definition of that is, and you're wearing a legal hat. But you do cross over to talk about the political side of this. Do you have a sense of where the political side is? So, for example, is it Jonathan Haidt?
Yes.
We've been pushing the fact that we shouldn't have the cell phones in the schools.
Yes.
And I think I saw today in Ballotpedia that we're up to 20-some states now are banning phones in schools. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a building of pushback in certain areas around technology.
Yeah.
Have you read any reports on the mindset of the public in terms of what direction they want to go? Because let's face it again, our politicians don't really do a lot these days. I don't know if Congress could take this on, and as you suggested, if there's a lot of money behind it, maybe they wouldn't take it on as well. But is there a public mood building, particularly to stop the algorithms, to make people be known who's moving information? Are you aware of any of that happening?
Yeah, so it seems that the political arguments that get the most resonance are those that relate to the abuse of children. And maybe that's a way to start. And once people say what is working well for protection of children might also work well to protect the rest of us. But there are laws being promulgated with bipartisan support for internet safety for children, protecting them from exploitation. There are all kinds of internet predators out there.
And that could go back to algorithms as well, too, right?
Yes.
Okay.
But what they're doing with the private data of children, I think these movements about keeping phones out of schools, even Texas was pushing a law that would prevent children from entering pornography sites. That seems pretty reasonable, right? Just asking in the same way. I don't know if you've ever gone to...
As long as it's factual porn, it's okay.
Yeah. I mean, just asking for an age verification.
Right. Absolutely.
And so I think if we can start with, some of these things where it does seem that most Americans do want to protect children. Deep fake non-consensual pornography is another one where there are apps that young people can download, and they get a photo of the 16-year-old girl in their class that she posted on her Instagram of her in her soccer uniform, and they run it through the Nudify app, and now her face is on some deep erotic porn, and then that gets sent around on Facebook. Which is very humiliating for the person who is the subject of it. Some people think it's real, other people just think it's funny, but for the subject it's quite humiliating. And so we're seeing some states adopting laws that make it a crime to post non-consensual deepfake porn. So I think children might be the best gateway into creating some laws that, and people will say, well, if we can do it for children, should adults have to tolerate being victims of deep fake porn? And so maybe that's a way that we can address some of these things and get some political support for some of these reforms.
So we're going to go to the demand side quickly, but I'm going to have you put your professorial hat on one more time, because you do talk about equal time and the fairness doctrine. How do they play into this?
Yeah, so these are things that we used to have. The fairness doctrine was something that was an FCC rule, because licenses on the broadcast spectrum are scarce. Starting in the 1930s, when they started doling these licenses out, they said because for the privilege of running a radio station or a television station, if you are going to present one side of a political argument, you have to present the other side. It worked pretty well. That went away during the Reagan administration, in part just the deregulation mindset of the time. There were also some arguments that it was unconstitutional because you were forcing a broadcaster to air a viewpoint with which they might disagree. Again, there's always time, place, and manner accommodations that we need to make for the First Amendment, so I'm not sure about that. But one of the things we see is right about the time that the fairness doctrine goes away, we start seeing the rise of hate radio. We start seeing, Rush Limbaugh becoming very popular, shows where they don't have to give you the other side. So if you were to watch Fox News, you will get a one-sided presentation. If you were to watch MSNBC, you might also get a different but one-sided presentation. And they are no longer beholden to the fairness doctrine. If we had a fairness doctrine, they'd have to have somebody on representing both sides of an argument, and we would hear from those people. And as I said, I'm a big advocate of listening or reading or watching a variety of media, because I think that's where we get the best perspectives. As lawyers, it's not until you get both lawyers arguing their position that you can reach what you think is the right answer, right? Because you've heard this good advocacy from both sides. So that's the fairness doctrine, no longer existent in American communications. The equal time doctrine does still exist. You may recall a famous example recently of where NBC had to provide an accommodation when Kamala Harris appeared on Saturday Night Live. She did a quick, little appearance, and there was some outcry that she was getting free commercial advertising time just before the campaign. And so in exchange, NBC gave the Trump campaign some equal time on a broadcast of some other NBC show. So equal time is still around. And
but it doesn't apply to websites or
that's right.
other things.
That's right. So Equal time is why you see, I know you said you don't watch television, but if you watch television during election season, you will see ads on the 6 o'clock news. You'll see the ad for, the Republican candidate, and then right afterwards you'll see the Democratic candidate. That's because they have to accept advertising from both parties. Does not apply to ads on the internet. And so it may be that what you see there is extremely one-sided. You are only seeing the ads from one campaign, and you're not seeing that equal time because we don't have that rule for social media or the internet.
Okay. So let's flip over to the demand side. And one of the things you talk about is trying to enhance media literacy, you call it. So what's the concept here, and how would you do it?
Yeah, so this is something that is borrowed from Finland, where they have been bombarded for decades with disinformation from their neighbor Russia. Russia is right there next to them, and they're constantly pushing disinformation in Finland. And so they have introduced it into the schools to help school children learn to read with a critical eye, to not necessarily trust what they read, but to question who is the source. Is this a credible source? Is there some sort of motivated reasoning behind all of this? Why does someone want me to believe this? Should I look for another source? And it has worked really quite well there in Finland, and I think we could do the same here in the United States, whether we call it critical thinking or critical reading, but just raising awareness. Not only
Is there a suggestion that it's had results?
There are programs, it's not part of a standard curriculum anywhere, but there are groups. I know there are bar associations that are introducing this into middle schools and high schools. I think also civics education could be really important. That is one of the casualties of our society's movement toward the STEM fields. And that's all wonderful. Science and technology are very useful things, especially as our society evolves. But civics education has really gone by the wayside. Many schools are not offering it anymore. And as a result, I think we have a lot of Americans who don't understand some of the basic structures of our government. And that is something that I think makes them susceptible to manipulation.
Yeah, one of the guests we had on here was from an organization called 311 Literacy, and I've got some relations there and understand their business model. And they're mostly trying to teach kids how to read. Mm-hmm. But as an offshoot of that now, they're now trying to develop civics curriculum, particularly for younger kids. Yeah. And I agree with you that we've just kind of lost something along the way here. So we're going to get towards the end here. Let's go back to something you mentioned earlier, but you do bring on the demand side. Online rating tools. How can we use technology to maybe ferret out some of this stuff and at least give people a place to go to understand if their reading is accurate or not, or what's behind it?
Yeah, I think technology could be the answer to problems with technology. Okay. Some of these deep fakes, for example, there's a researcher at the University of Michigan who uses artificial intelligence to detect deep fakes created with artificial intelligence. He fed all of Joe Biden's speeches ever into his language model, and as a result was able to detect when there was a false recording purporting to be Joe Biden's voice. They used him in some robocalls, and he could tell basically looking at the sound waves. So I think there can be some really good, interesting technological innovations that could help us. You could use... and
I assume AI could help in that regard.
Absolutely. Okay. Watermarking.
If they create the problem, they could hopefully help solve the problem.
Absolutely. Watermarking of photos so that we can tell whether they're genuine or they have been doctored in some way or altered or created. We could have labeling requirements to make sure people are aware if something was created with artificial intelligence. But you asked about rating systems, and I think that is something that can be very useful. And it could be something, if consumers care enough about it, it could be what makes one media outlet successful and another one less so. And so if we want people to understand these things, tell us about the rating service. And there are some of these, Snopes and others that will tell you, Ground News, another one, what is the bias, political bias of a particular outlet, and what is the accuracy and reliability of a particular news outlet. And I think most people would want something that maybe they are less interested in bias. Maybe they want something that replicates their own bias, but I think most of us want what's accurate. And so I think that we would at least be more informed consumers about the media that we are consuming. And I think over time it might tend to advance and make more successful the media outlets that are reliable and accurate, and the ones less so one would think in that marketplace of ideas, would become less successful business models and would eventually fold.
Well, I greatly appreciate you taking the time to visit with us today. There's some just excellent thinking in this book, and I hope you stay on this.
Thank you.
I mean, I hope you just don't write a book and go off to the next book or go off to whatever the next is for you, because you seem like the kind of person that's always going to have a next. I think we need to have people stay on this. So I think you need to figure out how to enhance your own messaging and maybe work with some of these groups to actually design some of the legislation that you want to have, and work with some of the, like you said, work with children's groups and get there. Because I get a feeling when you're on something, it's like a dog with a bone there, a Tiger fan wanting to win a World Series. There's some emotion there, and I just encourage you to stay on it.
Thanks very much.
I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. I know I have, and there's a lot here. Whether you read Barbara's book or just dig deeper on your own, as I said in the beginning, find articles to read on this topic. If nothing else, let's protect the kids. This is very important stuff, and if we don't get our arms around this, particularly as AI develops now, and this just explodes to a whole new level, and this alligator becomes the monster alligator from the monster movie, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. Before we get to the close, I promised at the beginning a bit of a teaser to explain to you why Professor McQuade is such a class act. If and when you read her book, you will find that she brings a political perspective to her book. And in my opinion, it was a bit skewed. So before we even got to the interview, I said, Professor, I hate both parties equally, and I don't want to have a skewed conversation here. So if you don't mind, if we change the tone or so and stay away from the political side of this, is that okay with you? And I got an immediate response, and she said, let's just go forward. So I thought it was a very classy thing to do. We probably didn't get into the book as much as she might have wanted us to. But she's a great representative for her topic, and she's definitely a class act.
Have you ever felt lost in the voting booth? With 518,000 elected officials in the United States, it's no wonder. Elections are complicated. From local school boards to the presidency, there are so many choices. And that's where Ballotpedia comes in, your one trusted source. Because the only unknown on your ballot should be who gets your vote. Our sample ballot lookup tool shows you exactly who and what will be on your ballot. Just enter your address, select your upcoming election, and prepare to vote informed. You can even save your favorites and print your completed sample ballot. With Ballotpedia, vote with confidence and vote informed.
For those of you who go back with me to the None of the Above programming, you know I strongly believe that our dysfunctional, polarized political system can be rectified through the creation of an effective, competitive third political party. I've not only messaged around this, but have written 2 volumes of an unfinished trilogy named Third Party. The first volume was published 15 years ago, but sadly, the dysfunction and polarization are now firmly entrenched in 2 diametrically opposed silos, while the war of words and hypocrisy show no signs of abating. The premise of the books is that an Aspen billionaire sets out to save our democracy by starting a third party at the state level in Illinois. His theory is that if the new party can elect sufficient number of state representatives and/or state senators to keep the Democrats or Republicans from having majority control, then the new party will be able to leverage critical votes to establish civility, cut deals to find legislative solutions for pressing issues, and bring the focus back to the center. A very simple theory that I know can work. Volume 2 focuses on the evil of gerrymandering, during which, especially over the past 10 to 20 years, the party in control draws maps that ensure continuation and acceleration of that control. Sadly, in almost 40 states, we now have governments that are solidly in one political camp, often veto-proof legislatures. At the federal level, Congress is hopelessly gridlocked, and states are now revising congressional maps contrary to long-standing traditions of redistricting only once after each decennial census. The bottom line on this out-of-control gerrymandering is that elected officials are, more than ever, choosing their voters instead of the voters choosing their elected officials. Against this backdrop, I recently drafted a letter to Elon Musk, telling him that his America Party idea can work. So with your indulgence, I'd like to read that letter and hope we can figure out how to get it delivered. Dear Elon, your American Party idea can work. It's easier than you think at a time when control of Congress is essentially deadlocked, and I'm guessing it might even cost less than the reported amounts you allegedly spent in the last election cycle. The key to the endeavor is understanding the extreme leverage that can be created by having a third party gain sufficient seats in either house of a legislature so that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans control a majority. I'm sure you've already noticed the leverage created in the two 2023 votes for Speaker of the House when small posses and renegade Republicans were able to drive major procedural concessions. The election of the Speaker of the House is the most important vote ever taken in any Congress. It's a bit different in the Senate, given the filibuster rules, but leveraging the vote for President of the Senate would still have significant consequences. Further, a third party controlling enough votes in either chamber would have total leverage over reconciliation votes. If it's fiscal reform you covet, reconciliation votes are the key. At this point in time, control of both the House and the Senate will again be extremely tight following the 2026 midterms. Should your America Party elect just 8 to 10 members in the House or just 2 to 3 in the Senate, game on. The added bonus is current polling that shows a significant rise in independent voters, along with historically low support for the Democrats and Republicans. I expect that to continue. Further, there will be a sufficient number of very far left Democratic primary winners and a sufficient number of very far right Republican primary winners to allow centrist third-party candidates to be highly competitive. Whereas an R would likely win in a district drawn to guarantee election of a D, I misspoke, whereas an R would not likely win in a district to virtually guarantee election of a D, and similarly, a D would not likely win in a district drawn to virtually guarantee election of an R. In many cases, the general elections end up being unopposed, thereby leaving room for a strong third-party effort. That's the easy part. Just takes money to vet and back the proper candidates and enough talented, tough campaign operatives to set and execute the strategy. The hard part will be getting America Party candidates on the ballot and withstanding vicious, unrelenting personal attacks. I was told by a board member from No Labels that their failure to field a third-party candidate for the presidential election in the last cycle was due more to personal threats received than the failure to find capable, willing candidates. The dominant parties have rigged the process to make it extremely difficult to gain ballot access. One route is to follow President Trump's playbook and co-opt one of the legacy parties, such as the Libertarians, who have already achieved ballot status. However, I don't recommend taking that route unless absolutely necessary, because the legacy parties have their own blemishes and mishigas. Timing is of the essence, but I'm guessing you are already researching ballot access issues. The hardest part will be the barbarous and slanderous personal attacks. Your candidates will need to find their inner Jackie Robinsons to withstand attacks on not just themselves, but their families and anyone sufficiently close, whether personal or in business, who the opposition deems fair game for annihilation. Your entire team will need to find the strength of the Founding Fathers from the Declaration of Independence, in which they pledged to each other their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. You've already personally faced this on a few occasions. You came in a darling of the Doge this year, which made you the enemy of the left. And you recently incurred the wrath of President Trump for expressing dissatisfaction with the big, beautiful bill. As the richest man in the world, and as someone who has spent his entire career pushing very heavy boulders up very steep hills, you understand the game and have been willing to take on all comers. You're both unique and steeled. Finding candidates ready to face this firestorm, however, will be much more difficult. Finally, you need to get the hell out of the way. From your public persona, that may be the most daunting challenge. You must avoid becoming an issue or the issue. Your contributions alone will drag you into the fray. But the America Party and its candidates must otherwise completely stand on their own. They will have to offer compelling solutions to key issues, and they will have to demonstrate complete independence if elected. The America Party may have a chance, but the Elon Musk Party will not have a chance. I've spent a significant portion of my career in politics and government and have written extensively on the need for a viable, competitive third party. Coincidentally, my third-party novels provide a roadmap from the perspective of a billionaire who wants to save our democracy. Please provide me your address, and I'll send you some books. Signed, Stephen H. Nemirovsky. Now, if you can help me get this message to Elon Musk, or for that matter, any other billionaire looking to ride to the rescue, you have my proxy. Let's get this party started. Thank you.